Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Following Donald Trump's executive order to declassify all remaining documents related to the assassination of JFK over 60 years ago, the FBI has uncovered 2,400 records related to the murder. First reported by Axios, the existence of the documents was reported to the White House last Friday. The nonprofit Mary Farrell Foundation, the country's largest source of Kennedy records online, said the announcement is huge and proves that the FBI is taking Trump's order seriously. Despite that enthusiasm, Axios claimed that the records are unlikely to prove whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone wolf. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, that sounds like almost the definition of faux news. A bunch of secret records discovered that don't change our understanding of what happened. I don't know, 2,400 files, records. What does that include? Like expense allowances, forms for various Dallas cops. I have no idea what's in there, obviously. But if the people who are in the know don't think it's going to change our perception of what happened, it sounds like faux news to me.
In the kind of canon of American conspiracy theories, including, did Stanley Kubrick fake the moon landing in a studio? Or I guess the kind of foundational one was King George actually engaged in a dark plot to crush our liberties. I guess on the spectrum from demonstrably nonsense to there are real and important questions here, where do you rate the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission? It does, at least from what I can tell, attract both insane and some sane people, unlike some of our other great national conspiracy theories.
There are a lot of historical events that we may never fully understand. This could well be one of them. I have to say, I'm one of maybe a minority of Americans who has never delved deeply into this. I did go so far as once to watch that Oliver Stone movie, JFK, and that pretty much made me feel like, okay, there may be a conspiracy here, but Oliver Stone has no idea what it is. There were so many levels of just where his story seemed so much less credible than the Warren Commission story. So I honestly don't know. And I'm not sure that we ever will know. At a certain point, you get so many interpretations, so many records, so many eyewitnesses, whatever. If anything, probably the most plausible reason, you have to ask, why would the government cover it up? What on earth, could be so terrible that a 60-year, stew of conspiracy theories and putting out the fake Warren report or whatever, that was somehow better than revealing the horrible truth. What was the horrible truth? The only one I can think of, and this may just show the limits of my imagination, would be that they really didn't want to show that what happened was that Fidel Castro got sick of Kennedy trying to assassinate him, and so acted preemptively to lay down a marker. And people wouldn't have wanted that to come out, especially not at the time, because this was just 13 months after the Cuba Missile Crisis. The Cold War was really at its peak. Would this have caused some kind of unstoppable demand for an invasion of Cuba, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That's the only thing I can think of that would have led those people to try to do that thing. But like I say, if there's anything more, we'll find out, and I'll be as interested as everybody else. But what I also felt really pretty much since about 1965, when I first started to think about this, did it happen in the way they describe, was I'm actually not sure that my life would change all that much if it turns out that it was two people and there was a grassy knoll involved or whatever. What difference does it make? I'm not sure it makes very much at this point, especially.
All right, our second story. A federal judge temporarily blocked Elon Musk's government efficiency team from accessing government systems to use to process trillions of dollars in payments, citing a risk that sensitive information could be improperly disclosed. The U.S. District Judge in Manhattan issued the order after a coalition of Democratic attorneys general from 19 U.S. states filed a lawsuit arguing Musk's Department of Government Efficiency has no legal power to access Treasury Department systems. Hours after it was issued, Musk called it absolutely insane and said the Treasury Department and DOGE had already agreed to require all outgoing government payments to include a rationale in the form of a comment and to have a categorization code. Walter, news or faux news?
Bit of both. I think the injunction is probably faux news in the sense that, if 19 attorneys general don't know how to forum shop and find a judge who will give them a temporary injunction, then our state attorney generals are just not doing their job. Whether this predicts a final legal outcome on this, it's very seems unlikely to me. The other thing is, last I heard, both the Treasury Department and DOGE reported to the same guy. His name was Donald Trump. And if it does turn out that there is some sort of bureaucratic issue and maybe, who knows, some convoluted statute somewhere actually does say, you have to jump through these seven hoops before you can do it. I wouldn't be terribly surprised if Donald Trump ordered the Treasury officials to jump through those seven hoops hand in hand with the DOGE people. So this feels more like delaying tactics and political theater than a sort of substantive change in what's been going on. I have to say, a lot of people have tried to use the courts to stop Donald Trump, both when he was in the White House the first time and then in the 4 years when he wasn't. I mean, convicted of felonies. They had him indicted all over the place. None of it seems to have had a whole lot of impact. So I am not sure that I'm not convinced that this particular legal strategy is going to be more effective than any one of the others. You get the feeling sometimes it's people just throwing spaghetti at the wall, throwing writs at the wall, hoping that one of them is going to work somewhere. A week from now, we may say, wow, they stopped it. But so far as I can tell, what they've done is sprinkled a little sand in the gears. But the process looks set to move ahead at some point.
There's been a big debate this week, real or imagined, about whether we're in a full-blown constitutional crisis 3 weeks into Trump's second term. People really seized on a tweet from J.D. Vance in particular to the effect that judges are not allowed to control legitimate executive power. Where do you fall on this debate about presidential authority?
As far as I can see, and I won't claim to have followed every twist and turn of this story, but from what I can see is just your ordinary reader of papers or scanner of pixels. I don't know if we should change that old newsprint expression now. I haven't seen a case where a judge has issued an order and the Trump administration has refused to obey it. I see plenty of cases where judges have issued orders and various officials in the Trump administration have said really nasty things about the order and occasionally even about the judge who gave the order. But so far, that doesn't look to be particularly different from some of the things President Biden said at various points about judges who fail to see the law his way. So, I think we'd only get to a constitutional crisis of the kind people are describing after a fairly lengthy process. Appeals, attempts to compromise, and so on, finally winds its way up to the Supreme Court, slowly or quickly. Maybe they find a fast track. Supreme Court rules. Then you have the potential for a constitutional crisis, but we're not there yet. I understand there's a very real fear that people have that we might actually get to that point and Trump would cross the Rubicon. But as far as I can tell, we're still several days march from the Rubicon, and I'm going to wait till we get there before, trying to pontificate about the end of the republic.
All right, final story of the week. A late 2024 survey of nearly 130,000 registered voters conducted by the Democratic polling firm Blue Rose Research showed that anti Semitic attitudes are far more prevalent among younger Americans than older Americans. The survey results showed that 18-year-olds are about 5 times more likely to have, quote, explicit anti Semitic attitudes than 65-year-olds. While the poll shows that young Trump supporters were on average a few points more anti-Semitic than young Kamala Harris supporters, David Shore, the firm's head of data science, said that according to data from the 2024 American National Election Studies Survey, self-described moderate voters of all ages were more likely to report, quote, cold feelings toward Jews than either liberals or conservatives. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, bad news that anybody has anti-Semitic feelings. I didn't hear from this whether they've gone up sharply or how sharply they've gone up. I would say that I've been around now long enough to have been listening to surveys about the attitudes of young people versus those of old people, long enough to have turned from a young person into an old person. And I've learned over these many decades to have a little bit of skepticism about polling about young people's feelings. Not that young people don't have feelings, young people have plenty of feelings. But something that maybe some others of our listeners have noticed is that young people are often moved by social fads, by events of the moment, so that some sudden event will have a greater impact on young people than on people who've been around for a while and maybe seen this kind of thing come and go. And also, young people tend to react to things on kind of a group basis. I mean, one very striking example is this whole business of trans, where you have sort of astronomically higher numbers of young people reporting that they feel that they're in the wrong body or something like that. And just historically, there have been sort of these waves of intense emotion or perception, most of which pass without leaving a lot of trace. So that as those young people get older, they just kind of move away from some of this. Now, are these surveys telling us that? I mean, are they pointing toward a sort of passing fad? Oh, some big music stars and people have been saying anti-Semitic things on the internet, and so people are well, they're following the herd. Or does this represent some darker turn in American society? I don't see how there's any way we could possibly know that now. But it does seem that in some ways you have a sort of a perfect storm of sort of emotional factors that could be driving this, the war in Gaza, a sense of kind of anti-establishment and alienation by many younger people as they look at a political system that, well, perhaps doesn't seem to be functioning all that well all the time. And the sort of general rise in conspiracy thinking, some of it due to the internet, maybe some due to other factors. So a lot's going on here, and it would be a very easy thing to just say, "Oh, the house is burning down." And you know what? The young people, this group of young people is more anti-Semitic than their elders. Obviously, the next group of people, young people, is going to be even more anti-Semitic than this. And the house is burning down, and it's all over. Maybe 5 or 10 years from now, we'll say, "Yeah, this was the moment when the house caught fire," or maybe not. We'll have to wait and see.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So, somewhat lost in the flurry of executive orders the last few weeks on shinier objects like DOGE and the Kennedy assassination and issues related to Gaza, has been Trump's war on the green climate agenda. He's pulled out of the Paris Agreement, dropped electric vehicle mandates, ended offshore leasing for wind projects, and fast-tracked fossil fuel infrastructure. You argued this week, Walter, that the primary consequence of all this will be to put economic pressure on China. Tell us what you mean and how we got there.
A slight quibble. I didn't say the primary consequence because, there could be some consequences in the environment too.
A consequence.
Yes, a consequence. Here's the thing. China is, the Chinese Communist Party is is at its core run by a group of technocrats who are extremely confident in their ability to fulfill the demands of a planned economy. And you give them a target, you give them a date, you give them an industry, and they can pretty well figure out a path to get there. So what they saw when this green agenda was put together, Paris Climate Accords, net zero stuff, there are going to be EV mandates, there's going to be this, there's going to be that. The Chinese went into high gear and said, aha, here is a whole set of massive opportunities where if we move quickly while the West is still asleep, we can achieve a total dominance of the exact industries that Western policymakers have decided are critical for the future of the human race. Basically, the West is going to deliver itself into our hands because those incompetent idiots don't know how to plan. And on this, the Chinese were 100% right. The Europeans, in particular, I think, the examples of profound European incompetence and simple loss of reality, of the ability to understand what reality is and respond to it, keep multiplying. Now, Europeans can certainly point the direction at Trump's Washington and say, what, we're out of touch with reality? But I have to say, that on major issue after major issues, Europe has simply pursued absolutely impossible policies for decades, digging in their heels, failing to understand the natural consequences of their own choices, and then being both surprised and appalled when suddenly they're in a world that they themselves designed and chose. And here's a great example. The Europeans had a larger role than really anybody else in designing this sort of climate agenda. And the EU has developed its green transition and all of the funding mechanisms and the regulations. Oh, the sort of social engineers of Brussels. They've tinkered, they've built. They've built this wonderful machine. But somehow the German car industry, the Dutch farming industry, these sort of key building blocks of the European economy, energy sector, didn't sort of get those memos from Brussels or didn't act. So the German car industry is completely blindsided by China's push to dominate the EV market and batteries. And again, China can work much faster and effectively because China can just issue decrees and create a home market and say, well, we're going to really super subsidize EVs and we're really going to push out gas-powered cars. And in their mind, it's not just, oh, we'll save the planet and everyone will love us, because in fact, they're still building an awful lot of coal mines, coal-fired plants for people that want to save the planet. But we're going to destroy the German car industry. Chinese industry we're going to control the solar panels. We're going to control the wind turbines. We're going to control the EVs. We're going to have the supply chains for the batteries. They just read this stuff and went out and acted, not, let's say, not doing anything wrong, but they acted in a very focused way so that they are now infinitely better positioned to deal with the Euro-American climate agenda than anybody in either Europe or North America. Now, to give the Biden administration some credit, it woke up and smelled the coffee and passed what I have to say was the ludicrously titled IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. It's one of these transparent acts of whitewash, which is how a party and a ruling establishment lose the trust of the public. It's a sort of lie so superficial and transparent that it fools no one, but telegraphs your intent to fool. Really a mistake. Call it the Green Futures Act or something, call it what it is. In any case, the Americans at least had some positioning here, but it did nothing. It was really rather late to try to contest China's economic dominance in these fields. So if now Trump blows up the Western climate agenda, which may have great consequences down the road, let's not say it won't, but in economic terms, what it could leave China with is a mass of factories that are producing EVs that no one is going to buy, or is producing solar panels and wind turbines that aren't going to have the subsidies that made them, made their market so good. So on top of its real estate bubble, on top of its other manufacturing overproduction, overcapacity issues, China will now also add to this a sort of great green glut of stuff they built thinking that there was a plan here. That was really the point of my column, that China, in a sense, the West created a trap for itself and fell into the trap. But it's possible that Trump may flip things and it will be China that's left in a trap somehow.
Given the political or, I guess, electoral consequences of the climate agenda for several center left and left wing and green parties kind of all over the Western world, do you expect it to remain a kind of central plank of the Democratic platform in 2028 and beyond? Or have we reached the kind of terminal endpoint for green politics as we've known it in America, regardless of what it does or doesn't mean for the climate itself?
No, I certainly don't think we've reached the end of it. But I think the Greens made sort of some colossal mistakes. And some chickens are now green chickens coming home to roost. And some of them are actually connected to this problem of how that China would seize the economic initiative. Because I think the Green Plan, to the extent there was a Green Plan, was that what you would do is on the one hand, you'd get governments, with the public support for fighting climate change, you'd get the governments to pass a bunch of regulations and limits and so on that would gradually over a period of time get tighter. So right now, when they might hurt and be unpopular, they aren't that bad. But as time goes on, it's like it'll go from, okay, you get a $300 tax credit if you buy an EV, to you can't buy an internal combustion car, or sort of moving from small nudges to really stringent changes. And what I think the green lobby kind of calculated here was that in the beginning, it's relatively easy to get this done because it doesn't cost much, doesn't inconvenience people much. But because you have this framework now with the entire global automobile industry knowing that by, some point in the next 10 or 15 years, nobody's going to be able to buy internal combustion cars anymore, or whatever the specifics are. All the car industries all over the world are going to be making massive investments in EV tech. And at that point, even if there's a kind of a revolt and people are unhappy, they're going to say, we don't like this regulation. The industry will now have so much commitment to it that the industry goes from being kind of an anti-green force in the beginning to being absolutely committed. Stay the course. We'll go bankrupt if you change the rules on us now. And in the same way, you'd get as the green sector gradually built up, think of all the workers who would now have jobs in EV plants or wind turbine plants, or you name it, all of these things. So you'd have, as the public is getting less attracted to the rising costs of green legislation, the lobbies backing green legislation, both in the popular sector, the voters and the unions, and in the corporate sector, and in the financial sector, because the banks will have lent a lot of money that won't go anywhere, won't come back to home to Papa if this stuff doesn't pay off. So this, I mean, and at the same time, as the consequences of climate change became more clear and the costs of that became higher, more people said, well, my insurance bill has gone really sky high. This is terrible. Those things would kind of keep the ball rolling toward the green future, even, as there were more reasons for more people to be unhappy with it. But China sort of wrecked that plan by preempting so much of the green industry. Okay, there is now a huge global green EV lobby. It's in China. All right. There's a financial sector which is totally committed to green industries and will really have a hard time if those industries don't go forward. And by and large, it's in China. And there are workers whose jobs are connected to these industries. But because China was so successful in grabbing a hold of all of this, suddenly, there's in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in the US, there's just there isn't as much support for the green agenda as the costs begin to bite. Now, I don't know how this is all going to work out. I try in the column, I try to keep prophecy to a minimum. But it does strike me this is not a future that the green movement expected to find itself facing. That even as more people were worried about climate change, even as more people in Los Angeles were looking at burned out homes, or in Florida were paying high insurance premiums because of hurricanes, that even then electoral resistance to the green agenda might grow rather than shrink.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Speaking of a possible constitutional crisis, Walter, or a constitutional crisis manqué, what book or books would you recommend to our listeners for understanding executive power in American history?
I looked at that query and thought about it for a little while because I don't spend a lot of time reading like books on the presidency. I'm not even a political scientist, manqué. I'm not a political scientist. And I often find that these kinds of abstract notions, kind of lead to generalizations that when you really get down and you kind of look at the nitty gritty, aren't as helpful as you might think they are. So I tend to read more books about presidents than books about the presidency. And I think if you're an intelligent or curious person and you keep thinking about it, you read enough books about about presidents, and you start having thoughts about the presidency. But these are always somewhat tentative, and that's probably a good idea. So, there are a lot of great books about American presidents that look at that will give you a lot of ideas about how presidential power rises and falls, what are its limits over history. You can compare, an FDR to a Martin Van Buren, and you can see very different types of presidencies. And I guess I would center in on presidents who have really made a difference. I think Andrew Jackson, obviously in our current time, is a good guy to read lives of. There's several very very useful ones there. Lincoln struggled to fight. Poor Lincoln. Half the kind of third of the country secedes because he was elected president. And then he has to then fight a bloody civil war in which, in order to win the Civil War, he'll need to keep the support of the people in the North who voted against him, right? Which is a very sizable minority. And to begin, and in the first couple of years, he was a terrible war leader. He was really not very competent, made a lot of big mistakes. And yet, nevertheless, through it all, he finds a way. He certainly accrues massive amounts of power. Woodrow Wilson, another president who goes through a war, who had to begin with pretty strong views on presidential power, but who turned while Woodrow Wilson was president after 1917 in the war, he was as close to a dictator as the country has ever known, I think. and he imprisoned his political opponents because of because of what they said, or rather, a very tricky idea became it wasn't a federal offense to say something, but it was a federal offense or to print it, but to send it through the mail was, so very clever stuff. And Franklin Roosevelt, I think, transformed the presidency. Nigel Hamilton's trilogy on Roosevelt at war, I think, is just a very good example of his war leadership, but also obviously what he did in the New Deal in building a whole sort of, really enlarging the number of federal agencies. But let's not forget also keeping control of the whole thing. For 12 years, Franklin Roosevelt sort of understood how the government under him worked and was able to kind of interfere and intimidate bureaucrats. People talk about Trump intimidating bureaucrats. FDR was very good at this. And he didn't even have to raise his voice. He had all kinds of ways of doing it. Truman's presidency with polls in collapse, terrible dangers, economic problems worse than any American president has faced really since then, and still managing to move the country. And again, made terrible mistakes, particularly in his first few months, had no idea what he was doing, partly because Roosevelt refused to tell him anything or give him any chance to learn. So, the presidency is it's something that it's a work in progress. People talk about, do we have a living constitution or should we be originalists? We certainly have a living presidency that evolves over time. I mean, Harry Truman once said, what is it that you come into the, and you get into the office and you see all these impressive, these large wheels and levers and so on, and you're really excited. You go in there and you realize they're not connected to anything. And so, learning how to make the presidency work. You have some presidents like Jimmy Carter. Well, look, the American presidency, if you compare it to what you have in the UK, it's almost a combination of the king and the prime minister. The president is the head of state, and so the kind of symbolic, you know, embodiment of the nation, leader of the nation, but is also in charge of making the government work. And I think people have approached that office in two different ways. Some of them have said the way to be a successful president is to be a really good prime minister. That is to really, get down in the weeds of making the government work. And if you do that, people will so admire your skill at solving problems and making things work that that will kind of give you the authority and the majesty and the power needed to carry off the whole role. I think that is the Jimmy Carter approach to the presidency. The Ronald Reagan approach to the presidency, the JFK approach to the presidency, the Franklin Roosevelt is not making any partisan points here, is no, the thing to do is to use and enhance that prestige, that larger than life thing that you get as the kind of symbolic head of the nation, and do that so well that you end up with power to get all this other stuff done. That it's more important to be a good king than to be a good prime minister. Now, for better or for worse, I think Biden was almost the quintessential prime minister, not really out in public a lot, working on, fine tuning things behind the scenes, whatever, but not really stepping into that larger role very, very often or even very effectively when he tried. Trump is the opposite. And everything about the Trump presidency since January 20th has been about making himself loom larger, which is difficult in his case, but making him loom larger and larger in the public mind, the center of everything, the relentless engine driving the train, and that sort of impression of greatness, of power, of dynamism, that then allows you to win a lot of these little fights that happen, whether it's getting your cabinet people confirmed or getting your way with various obstreperous bureaucrats, all that kind of stuff. So we're seeing in operation now that kind of approach to the presidency.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.